Welcome back to the Deep Dive. Our mission today is, well, it's an exploration into some pretty incredible historical longevity. We're diving into the core of Hebrewism, that really powerful world-shaping tradition that's all centered on a fundamental idea of law. And our sources frame its outcome as nothing less than leveling the religious playing field, which is a pretty bold way of putting it.
It's an extraordinary historical claim. It really is. And, if we're going to accept it, we have to find an explanation that goes way beyond standard military history or just accidents of geography.
Right.
And what the sources reveal is this critical and I think often overlooked insight. The whole significance of this tradition comes down to the fact that its principles, they were consistently verified by concrete, observable history.
So real-world validation.
Exactly. It's that practical validation of its core beliefs that I think we're really missing in a lot of modern analysis.
That distinction feels key because when we study this era, especially that really challenging period after the Babylonian exile, we tend to focus on the dramatic stuff.
The Maccabees.
The Maccabees, right. Orange resistance. But our source material is pushing us past the revolts and the battles. It says we need to look for the underlying principles.
Its operating system.
Yeah, the philosophical and theological operating system that guaranteed its survival against these, the sources call them cultural tsunamis.
Precisely. And look, to understand 1,000 years of really complex history, you just can't memorize every detail, every king. It's overwhelming.
Impossible.
And details are always changing, but the underlying law, the principle, that's simple. It's stable. It's unifying. So our first step has to be to isolate that simple governing law that let this tradition hang on while entire empires rose and fell all around it.
Okay, so let's start where the source material does, at the very beginning of the argument. This idea of a creator and a single unifying law. If you just look at the world, the seasons, the planets, gravity, you see constant order.
Harmony.
And this universal harmony, this predictability, it's proof of two things. First, yes, there must be a creator, or at least a powerful organizer.
But secondly, and this is the crucial part for our deep dive, it proves there must be a single unifying law that governs absolutely everything.
Because if there were multiple laws,
you'd get chaos. Imagine multiple commanders all shouting different orders at the same time. The universe would just, fall apart.
So this is basically what we've traditionally called natural law. And the source argues that this is the ultimate yardstick.
It is.
So any law that a human society creates, a constitution, a code of ethics, whatever, it has to align with this universal governing principle to actually last.
Absolutely. Think of it like the operating system of the cosmos. Human laws are just applications running on that OS. If the app doesn't respect the core code, it crashes.
Okay.
Now, here's the crucial philosophical pivot. The universe has a dual structure, right? There's the visible material world and then the invisible spiritual world.
And when the source says spiritual world, it's not just talking about some faraway afterlife. It means the immediate world of mind, thought, consciousness.
That's right. And the critical argument here is that the law governing that invisible realm of thought and spirit has to be exactly the same as the law governing the material world.
So you can't have one set of rules for salvation and another for, say, economics.
You can't. Because if the law is different for each, you create this destructive separation, a dualism. And that means faith becomes superficial. It asks you to ignore the reality of physics and history for some kind of special spiritual exception.
Which doesn't hold up.
No. True faith, the source argues, requires the same eternal law to govern everything from the motion of stars to the morality of a business deal. The proof of the spiritual has to be visible. It has to be historical.
So if this one law governs everything, including competition and, life itself, how does the source say it determines who or what survives? We're always taught it's survival of the strongest.
And that's a fundamental misunderstanding, according to this material. The strongest, the mightiest. They only survive for a little while. The sources even point to dialectics, that pattern where one force gets dominant, but that dominance immediately creates a challenger that then overthrows it.
The never-ending cycle.
It never ends. The strongest is always a temporary title. The strongest empire is just the next dynasty's footnote.
So if it's not strength, what is the ultimate criterion for survival?
It's not about being the strongest, but about being the highest and the fittest. Highest means having the superior inherent value, and fittest means being the best practical solution for the world you're in. That's the real unchanging law of the universe, and it applies to everything.
I see. So the source uses this to analyze why some cultural forces just sweep through history. We're not just talking about biological evolution here, though.
No, though the sources would say evolution is just one expression of this law. We're talking about cultural survival in economics, in academia, and especially in religion.
So when a tradition survives for thousands of years, it means it offered the highest and fittest ideology.
Exactly. The source points to three huge cultural movements that were like historical tsunamis: Hellenism, the rise of Islam, and, in modern times, communism. They gained so much traction because they offered a superior practical solution to life on Earth.
Which brings us to the famous rice bowl test that's in the sources.
Yeah.
You mentioned the example of Islam's rapid spread in certain periods. We assume conversions are about, deep theological debates.
But the average person isn't reading theology. They're looking at their daily lives. The source argues that when aristocratic forms of Christianity were dominant, the common person saw a system that kept huge gaps between the rich and poor.
And then Islam shows up, proposing a different social order.
Yes. And the individual looks at this new system and thinks, this offers a better, more immediate solution to my basic needs, my rice bowl problem. It just offered a better quality of life. If your faith doesn't solve the problem of living a dignified life right here, people are going to naturally move toward the system that does.
So the highest value any system has to pursue is one that actually solves the problems of poverty and wealth disparity, and also differences in social status. A truly valid faith in this framework has to deliver that solution here and now.
Which leads us straight to the source's most radical assertion. The common theological idea that the kingdom of God is just some place you go after you die where there's no suffering is intensely criticized.
Yeah, the source uses a really strong word for it, calling it a form of historical misinformation or even fraud. That's a huge accusation.
It is. And the defense comes back to the principle we just established. The law has to be unified. It has to govern both the material and spiritual worlds. If you push the solution to poverty and inequality off into an afterlife, you're basically saying your faith doesn't have to pass the rice bowl test today. You remove the need for it to be verified in history.
True value has to solve suffering in this world.
For the system to prove it's the highest and fittest, yes.
But, that sounds like what a lot of political philosophies try to do. Democracy, or the ideal version of communism, they all aim for a world without inequality. But they often fail, too.
They do, and the source explains why. Philosophical approaches. They aim for the ideal, but they fail because human power is limited. It's imperfect. To actually realize the ideal world described by the law, you have to move beyond the limits of philosophy into theology. You need a divine truth applied perfectly, not just a human ideal chased imperfectly.
Which brings us back to Hebraism's foundation, the law. So if the whole tradition's success is built on this one law, how do we deal with the Apostle Paul, who seems to say the law itself should be rejected?
This is the critical distinction. If you miss this, the whole historical narrative just falls apart. Paul was absolutely not rejecting the original eternal divine law we've been talking about.
He was rejecting something else.
Something else entirely. He was rejecting what the source calls the article law or clause law, the really intricate, detailed, man-made regulations. These rules weren't handed down at Sinai. They were created by Jewish leaders after the Babylonian exile in response to crises like Hellenism.
Wait, so Paul wasn't rejecting the Ten Commandments, but all the layers of detailed legal interpretation built around them over centuries.
Precisely. They were emergency measures, defensive rules created to save the entire culture from being wiped out. And the failure to distinguish between the one divine law and these thousands of specific human-made article laws, that is a fundamental error. It changes how we understand everything about that era.
Let's pivot to that crisis then, the one that made those clause laws necessary, Hellenism. The source describes it as a full cultural sweep, a wave that was threatening to just wash away Jewish identity.
It was more than a military threat. It was total cultural absorption. The source gives these vivid descriptions of Jewish children becoming obsessed with Greek culture. It was the ancient equivalent of kids obsessing over the latest imported snacks and foreign sports.
And the most problematic part was the Greek athletic games, especially wrestling, where everyone competed naked.
That was incredibly destructive. It immediately exposed the cultural and religious difference of circumcision and turned it into this painful, socially ostracizing mark. This wasn't just a theological problem, it was existential. How do you keep your identity when your kids are desperate to assimilate?
And this is where the scribes and the Pharisees come in. We often see them portrayed negatively, but the source says they played a heroic, necessary role here.
They were the intellectuals who saw the law was being eroded, so they undertook this critical process of rediscovery, reinterpretation, and application. They saw the problem was assimilation, so the solution had to be aggressive separation.
And their main tool for building that defense became the Sabbath law. The original command to keep it holy got transformed into these incredibly specific, strict prohibitions, the article laws we were just talking about.
And that's where we did the structure of the three no's, these defensive regulations that basically built a cultural wall around the community.
Okay, let's break those down because they really show how desperate the situation was. What was the first no?
First was no labor. And this went way beyond just, taking a day off. It included strict rules against things like cooking. And the ultimate reason wasn't just about rest. It was to stop people from eating food prepared by non-Sabbath keepers. It was a dietary wall to keep Hellenistic influence out of the kitchen.
That's fascinating. It wasn't just theology. It was about stopping cultural contamination through food. What was the second no?
Second was no contact. This meant you had to strictly avoid even touching people who were seen as impure because they didn't follow these Sabbath rules. It created this intense social insulation. You just couldn't mingle.
And the third?
No movement, limiting how far you could travel on the Sabbath, usually just far enough to get to the local synagogue. This is also where rules against non-emergency medical treatment on the Sabbath came from.
Understanding these three, no labor, no contact, no movement, it completely changes the context of stories like the Good Samaritan, doesn't it?
It brings so much historical clarity. Suddenly you understand that the priest and the Levite who walked past the dying man, they were doing it because they were strictly observing the no-contact law. If they touched a potentially dead or unclean man, they would violate the very defense mechanism they believed was essential for their entire culture's survival.
So they were prioritizing the clause law, the preservation of their culture over spontaneous compassion. And at the time, that was seen as absolutely vital. Cultural extinction was the ultimate failure.
And that defense had two other pillars. First, a massive historical reinterpretation, which you see in texts like the Book of Chronicles, designed to instill a unique, superior identity, to remind people who they were.
And second, the explosion of apocalyptic literature.
Yes. Apocalyptic literature was the ultimate spiritual armament. It wasn't about predicting the end of the world. It was about instilling a spirit of deep resistance against the current oppression, a tool for spiritual mobilization.
What a multi-layered strategy. It's clear Hebraism's victory came from its ability to translate its highest spiritual value, that unifying law of order, into practical, immediate solutions for poverty, social status, and most critically, cultural survival.
And this is the final provocative thought our sources leave us with. They insist that this whole period, from the post-exile era up to the New Testament, is the greatest lesson in human history on how a community can face down overwhelming cultural threats. And yet, paradoxically, it remains the most misunderstood chapter in Western thought.
So if that community facing the Hellenistic tsunami had to radically rediscover and reinterpret their fundamental principles just to survive, what kind of reinterpretation of our own deepest values might be needed today to address the modern cultural and economic realities you face? Something powerful for you to mull over until our next deep dive.